Alright, today I'm doing something I actually don't do too many of these, and that's I am going to be bushing a Mosin Nagant bolt. And if you don't know what bushing means, essentially what we are doing is removing material from the bolt and basically pressing in or inserting a new piece of steel, and then we re-drill the hole and basically make a whole new firing pin hole. And that hole is always should be smaller, alright? And I think with the Mosin Nagant, this is actually probably one of the most rewarding things that you can do for your Mosin Nagant, and especially if you hand load, okay? Factory ammunition, probably it's not something you're going to see a big difference on. But with hand loads, it will allow you to shoot, you know, to book max even if you want to, and without, you know, being dangerous. So here are two different Mosin Nagant receivers that I have here. This one's a gem. This is a 1895 French-made receiver. But let's pull it out here. And this guy has already been trued up for a customer. And if you can see, actually, well, let's pull out the other bolt as well. This is just one that I have in stock here. So the French bolt, as you can see, this has been trued and also bushed. And you'll notice the difference of the size of the firing pin hole. It's dramatically smaller. And like I said, this is one of the most rewarding things you can do, because this firing pin hole was designed back in the days when black powder was what the Mosin Nagant ran. And with modern smokeless powders, obviously we run at a little bit higher PSIs, but the receiver and the bolt are plenty strong enough to handle modern smokeless powders. It's just the firing pin hole is, well, a little bit left to be desired. Alright, so before we begin, let me outline an extremely important safety thing when you are actually bushing a bolt. This drawing right here, this is my quick sketch of a Mosin Nagant bolt head. It shows you the black as the outside outline of the bolt head, and then the red here basically represents the firing pin channel that is on the inside of the bolt. And as you can see, it actually starts out quite large and then it tapers down. Now, what this blue area represents is the material that we're going to remove from the bolt head. It'll probably be a little bit smaller than this, but this is removed, and then a new piece of metal is inserted, and then we re-drill the hole, and it'll be quite a bit smaller than this. So I can do a blaze orange. You can't hardly see that, but anyways, it'll be smaller than that. Now, it's very important that you see the shelf right here that is left behind. This shelf needs to be both plenty big still, but it also, the bushing needs to be larger than this original channel down here, because if it's smaller, these little shelves could break off and then the bushing could get pushed through the bolt head. So that's a very important safety feature that you need to be aware of. And I know I personally, with every bolt that I do, especially Remington 700s, because this is something I have to do with Remington 700s as well, is I drop a dowel pin down here, or a gauge pin, and I find out how big this channel is, and then I know that I need to make this bushing at least 10 thousandths larger than this channel, so that way it can never be pushed through the rifle. You know, so the bushing will go in, it'll sit on the shelf, and it will never be pushed any further back into the rifle because of that shelf, and also because it will have material the whole way down that prevents the pushing from being pushed through the rifle ever from like a catastrophic failure. So yeah, that right there is quite important, and you need to understand that before you actually attempt to do this. This part is a little bit tricky, and this is probably the part that you will actually spend the absolute largest amount of time on, because you have to do this twice. And that is holding on to this thing. Yes, there's a lot of cuts on the Mosin Nagant bolt head, and every single one of those cuts and channels actually does something, and it performs a function, which is kind of one of the cool things about the design of the Mosin Nagant. It is a well thought out design. And anyways, at this point, you can either use a 3-jaw or a 4-jaw for this, but either one, you are going to need the ability to center the thing up, because every single one of them is different. These things were filed and buffed down by hand, and I'm using a 4-jaw here today. Now, if I was truing this up, I would actually set it out a little bit further so that I could take a cut off the back of the lugs and the face at the same time. But that's also something we would do in the second operation. Right now, we're basically just getting this thing aligned as best we can in the center, and we're going to use a dial indicator, and I actually go off of the inside of the rim of the face. And you're going to spend a lot of time moving the jaws and also probably tapping on this with a rubber hammer to kind of jar it into straightness with the lathe. And now fortunately these are floating bolt heads, which means that concentricity is actually very forgiving. So any improvements that we can make to this will actually go a long ways. And like I said, it's a very forgiving design. So even if it's not perfect, you know, it will be vastly better than it was the 100-something years ago this bolt head was made. The firing pin holes on these things, you know, they're never centered, so it's not what you're going to want to dial in. But if you want to get yourself roughly close, you can bring a center up to the hole and just watch it, and you can kind of eyeball it in and get it in close. That way when you come in with your dial indicator, you're not beyond the range of the dial indicator, because this right here is a 5/10,000ths and it's a little too sensitive to just start on. This will get you at least close. All right, so we have it dialed in here. I'll turn it on. As you can see, we've got it dialed in. This one's actually very straight. I'm pretty impressed with this one. Some of the round receiver bolt heads are actually quite good, and some of them are not. They're pretty random. So before I make this cut, and now that I've got it dialed in and everything, I'm actually going to make a blue mark on the bolt head and also on the lathe chuck jaws, because we're going to have to take this out of here and put it back in later on, and this will just help us to get closer faster. So now let's drill our initial hole. This is a 3-flute end mill. Alright, and this next part, this is the pretty tricky part, and I'm probably going to do this off camera just because the tripod's in the way. But we are going to basically bore the hole out to a large enough size so that, like I said earlier, the bushing is bigger than the through hole that is in the back end of the bolt head itself. Now, typically these bushings are actually the same size as the primer, which is great because it means that since we're not truing this one up, we're going to make the bushing just a tad bit proud. And if you're seating your primers below flush, you know, and also factory ammo will be seated below flush, this bushing isn't actually going to touch the cartridge in any way, even though it is sitting just a tad bit proud. It'll be like a 10,000th or so proud. All right, so I've been at this for a little bit here, basically using this micro boring bar to enlarge the hole, and I'm using the carriage stop. Actually, the carriage stop that I'm using is the one off of my Precision Matthews 12x36. So the carriage stop for the 12x36 is compatible with the 1440 GT that they make. Fun fact. But yeah, there we go. That's a 225 dowel pin, perfect fit. And that'll make our bushing larger than the actual through hole. Alright, so we're now at my other lathe over here on the other side of the shop, and a precision gauge set, a precision set of dowel pins, I should say, or gauge pins, is a very handy thing, and actually it's absolutely essential if you're going to do this. So basically we're finding the exact size dowel pin that fits in the new hole, and now we're going to make a bushing, and the bushing is going to be mushroom shaped with a little root stem on it, and that is because it helps us to kind of level the thing out and push the thing in straight when we take it to the arbor press. But also with the gauge pins we can basically get the exact size, because this thing is going to have to be 2 to 3 thousandths oversized. That way when we press it in, it's basically the metal is literally galled together, which is kind of almost like welding it together. So we've basically done a couple of cuts here. So there's actually the inner hole, which we actually found a gauge pin that fit that. And from that, we basically make this inner stem. This inner stem actually protrudes deeper into the bolt head. And what that does is it allows the firing pin to always be in the bushing even when the firing pin is fully retracted and cocked. And this is important because it lays support to the firing pin, and since we're going to be making the firing pin tip a lot smaller, it's going to be a little more delicate. You know, we need to trade it like it should be traded, kind of like a lady, and keep it in the bushing at all times. So that's what that little stem is right there. This guy right here is basically about 3/1000ths larger in diameter than the actual bushing hole is, which means that when we press it in, it'll basically be welded in there, so to speak. And also you'll notice that this is a little bit of a rough finish. I leave a rough finish on purpose, and that is because the guy who taught me how to do this told me to do that. And it'll allow the bushing to go in a little bit better without like shearing too much metal off, because it'll just shear off the high spots rather than, I don't know, gulling the entire thing, because you don't want any pockets around your bushing. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take this guy and we're actually going to start the hole on the opposite side. So there's just a slight little funnel on the back side of the bushing. And then we will also come in from the other side and actually start the hole. That way when we drill from the opposite side, this inner hole will be just slightly larger. So we got an internal funnel, so to speak, on the inside. Gives us a little bit more forgiveness, especially if you're in dirty conditions. Now at this point what we're going to do is the top of the mushroom head of the bushing, we're going to knock off that little stem, but we're also actually going to give it a bit of a dip in the middle, and that's because we want the outside edges to be what are pressed against our arbor press when we actually push this into the bolt head. Here we are, moment of truth. This is a 4-ton arbor press. You notice I'm kind of just pushing it a little bit at a time. We rotate it each time. That way that mushroom doesn't have the ability or the opportunity to tilt over on us at all. And I can feel it hit bottom. Alright, we are ready to go finish this off in the lathe now. We're back in the lathe. We've lined up our two blue marks. And then I've got two lighter blue marks here. These are the two jaws that I loosened. And then of course we're going to get back in here with a dial indicator. We'll check all of this again, make sure that we are still true. And then we'll basically face it off and drill the new firing pin hole. And the bolt head will basically be done. This is kind of a fun part. Now that we've got the head's been bushed, we need to downsize the firing pin to actually fit the new hole. And it's not too bad. So the Russians, they must be sticking this into a 3-jaw chuck when they actually make all these cuts. But basically what we have to do is kind of find the exact same spot that they had this thing in when they cut it, all right? And this is just a trial and error. You know, just keep rotating it around. We'll try different depths and so forth until we find it will start running true, okay? And this takes a little while. It's just a process. I'm not going to show you the whole thing because you'll get bored. Trust me. That right there actually looks really close. Alright, so that looks good enough. This should work. We're going to decrease the diameter of the firing pin. We're also going to reshape the tip a little bit and make the tip here just a little bit longer Now for this particular cut, I use a piece of high-speed stainless steel. I don't use carbide, and the reason for that is because we're making a very long unsupported cut here. We need to take a very, very small amount of material off at each time, and getting high-speed stainless steel sharp is something that's pretty easy to do. This tool gets sharpened every single time I do one of these. So I've done quite a few passes now, and this takes a little while. This takes actually about half an hour to basically get the firing pin down to this profile. One of the nice things about independent head bolts is that, yeah, I can test the fit without removing the firing pin from the lathe, which is a nice convenience. Bolts that are all one piece, like a Remington 700, obviously I charge more for those because, well, they take a lot more work. You know, every time you remove something from the lathe, it's got to be dialed back in when it's put back in. So there, we've tested it for fit. We've got plenty of clearance, and we've got, because before we had like close to 20 thousandths gap between the firing pin and the firing pin hole. Not to mention we reduced the firing pin hole from about, I think it was 118 thousandths hole down to a 67 thousandths hole. So dramatically smaller. This will allow this shooter to basically do hand loads at the correct PSI levels for this cartridge, rather than having to, you know, baby the thing because, you know, the firing pin is so oversized. Also, we did a little bit of polishing to it, and we did touch up the tip. When I'm reassembling these things, because we have reduced the size of the firing pin tip, we're basically now punching the primer with something that's a lot smaller, so we don't need as much spring force. And often, and I know this customer in particular, he wanted a lighter bolt lift, we can actually reduce the tension on the firing pin spring, you know, a significant amount. Usually, I know like with Savages, I usually cut about 1.5 coils off, and I measure it to see how much poundage there is. Remingtons, sometimes you can cut 2 coils off of one of them. But yeah, because we're using a smaller firing pin tip, we don't need as much force per square millimeter, I guess we could say, on the tip of that in order to indent the primer the same amount. And that's one of the side effects, is you get a lighter bolt lift. And this is one of the reasons why in the old days, before custom actions were kind of a thing, bushing your bolt was considered an essential thing if you wanted to get into bench rest shooting, which is kind of one of the things that I do a lot, and that's where I learned this process. I hope you found this enjoyable, and if you do find this a little too daunting to try yourself and you want to send it to me, some pieces of advice: one, contact me through my website. The other one is send it in one of these USPS small priority box, the flat rates. They're kind of the perfect size for a bolt. You can actually fit about 3 bolts into one of those things, and I think I had one guy pack 4 into one of those things, but that's a little tight. So yeah, it's a nice cheap way to send it to me, and just make sure you put full contact info and a phone number in there so that I can call you when it comes. All right, hope you learned something in this video. Thank you for watching.